On a routine flight from Chicago to Charlotte, the cabin was a pressurized capsule of quiet anxieties and muted expectations. But that fragile peace was about to be shattered. What started with the innocent sobs of a heartbroken 7-year-old boy would ignite a firestorm at 35,000 feet. You are about to hear the story of a man whose arrogance led him to bully a grieving child and the quiet, elegant grandmother who refused to let it stand. But the story doesn't end there. Stick with me to witness one of the most shocking and satisfying cases of instant karma ever recorded, a moment that didn't just silence a bully, but dismantled his entire life before the plane even landed. The air inside Flight AA1827 was a familiar cocktail of recycled oxygen-burnt coffee and the faint synthetic cherry scent of cabin cleaner. For most of the 178 passengers settling in for the 2-hour journey from Chicago O'Hare to Charlotte Douglas, it was a day like any other. Businessmen tapped anxiously at laptops, families wrangled with carry-ons, and students slumped into their seats, headphones already in place as a shield against the world. For Hannah Juliet and her 7-year-old grandson, Leo, the air was thick with something else entirely, a grief so heavy it felt as though it had its own gravitational pull. Hannah, a woman of 72, whose posture still held the disciplined grace of her years as a constitutional law professor, stared out the small, scratched window. But she didn't see the flurry of ground crew activity on the tarmac. She saw the face of her husband, James, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he told one of his famously terrible jokes. He had been gone for 3 days, the victim of a sudden, merciless heart attack, and the world had felt off-kilter ever since. Beside her, Leo was a small, tightly coiled bundle of sorrow. He clutched a worn teddy bear, Captain Fuzzy, a gift from his grandfather from a trip to the Air and Space Museum years ago. The bear's button eyes had seen every one of Leo's childhood adventures, but now they were a solemn audience to his first great tragedy. Leo hadn't spoken much since the news. He communicated in nods and shrugs, his big brown eyes swimming with a confusion that broke Hannah's heart every time she looked at him. They were flying to Charlotte for the funeral. It was a flight James was supposed to have taken with them for a family reunion. The irony was a cruel, sharp-edged stone in Hannah's chest. She placed a gentle hand on her grandson's shoulder. "It's a big plane, isn't it, sweetie?" She whispered, her voice a low, soothing hum. "Grandpa would have loved telling you all about the engines. He'd call it a marvel of modern engineering." Leo simply nodded, burying his face deeper into Captain Fuzzy's matted fur. The plane began its slow, lumbering taxi away from the gate. Leo's knuckles wrapped around the bear were white. He had always been a sensitive child, one who felt the world's emotions as if they were his own. His grandfather's absence wasn't an abstract concept. It was a physical void, a cold draft in the warm house of his life. As the aircraft swung onto the runway, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their imminent departure. The engines spooled up the low hum, escalating into a deafening, all-encompassing roar. The force of the acceleration pressed them back into their seats. For Leo, the sudden, violent power was too much. The carefully constructed dam around his grief finally broke. It started as a hitch in his breath, a tiny, choked sound that Hannah felt more than heard. Then came a quiet whimper. He squeezed his eyes shut, and tears began to leak from the corners, tracing clean paths through the faint grime of travel on his cheeks. As the wheels left the ground, and the plane banked steeply over the suburbs of Chicago, the whimper turned into a sob. It wasn't the loud, attention-seeking wail of a tantrum, but a sound far more painful to hear, the desolate, helpless cry of true heartbreak. Hannah wrapped her arm around him, pulling him close. "Shh, my love, it's okay. We're just going up. Look." She tried, pointing out the window. "You can see all the little cars. It's like a toy set." But Leo was inconsolable. The roar of the engines, the feeling of being untethered from the earth, the gaping wound in his heart, it all converged into a single point of overwhelming misery. His sobs grew louder, punctuated by gasps for air. Several passengers turned to look, their expressions ranging from sympathy to mild annoyance. A young woman in the row ahead offered a small, compassionate smile. A flight attendant, a kind-faced woman in her late 20s named Sarah, began to make her way down the aisle. Her brow furrowed with concern. But before she could reach them, a voice from the row behind them cut through the cabin's ambiance like a shard of glass. "For God's sake, can someone make that kid shut up?" The voice was sharp, impatient, and dripping with disdain. It belonged to a man in his late 40s, dressed in a tailored navy suit that likely cost more than a month of Hannah's mortgage. His hair was perfectly coiffed, a silver streak at the temple, lending him an air of distinction that his tone immediately betrayed. He was tapping furiously on a silver laptop, a gold Rolex glinting on his wrist with every aggressive keystroke. His name was Richard Peterson, though he preferred Rick, and his world revolved around closing deals and maximizing efficiency. A crying child was in his calculated worldview, a profound and unacceptable inefficiency. Hannah stiffened. She chose to ignore him, focusing all her energy on Leo. "It's all right, baby. Just breathe with Grandma. In and out. That's it." Leo's crying hitched but didn't stop. The plane leveled out, and the fastened seatbelt sign pinged off. Rick Peterson, however, was just getting started. "Unbelievable," he muttered loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. "Parents these days have no control. Drug him or something. I have $1 million presentation to prepare." The comment hung in the air, toxic and vile. The sympathetic smiles on nearby faces vanished, replaced by looks of shock and discomfort. Hannah felt a familiar cold fire ignite in her belly, the same fire that had fueled her through decades of fighting for the voiceless in courtrooms and classrooms. She took a deep, steadying breath, still rubbing Leo's back. She would not engage. Not yet. Her grandson was her only priority. But a line had been drawn. The flight attendant Sarah arrived at their row, her expression a practiced mask of professional calm, though her eyes betrayed her unease. "Is everything all right here, ma'am? Can I get him some water or perhaps some apple juice?" "Thank you, that's very kind," Hannah replied, her voice steady despite the fury coiling in her gut. "Some water would be lovely. He's having a difficult day." "Of course," Sarah said, her gaze soft as she looked at the sobbing child. She turned slightly, her body language creating a subtle barrier against the man behind them. "And, sir," she said, addressing Rick Peterson with a tone of forced politeness, "we do ask for a little patience. The little boy is clearly distressed." Rick scoffed, not even bothering to look up from his laptop. "Distressed? He's being a brat, and I'm a paying customer." "First class, I might add," he said, gesturing vaguely towards the front of the plane, though he was seated in premium economy. "My comfort is being compromised by a lack of parenting." The accusation was a direct strike. Hannah's protective instincts, honed over a lifetime, surged to the forefront. She could feel Leo flinch at the man's harsh tone, his small body trembling against hers. He tried to stifle his sobs, turning them into little hiccuping gasps. that were somehow even more heart-wrenching. "Sir," Hannah said, turning her head just enough to look over her shoulder. Her voice was low, but it carried an unmistakable weight of authority. "He is a 7-year-old child who is grieving. I would appreciate it if you showed a shred of human decency." Rick finally looked up, his steel blue eyes cold and dismissive. He took in Hannah's appearance, her simple grey cardigan, her neatly pinned silver hair, the age lines etched around her eyes, and made a swift, contemptuous judgment. He saw an old woman, frail and irrelevant. "Grieving? Oh, please." He sneered, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. What's he grieving the end of screen time? "Look, lady, I don't care what his issue is. This is a public space, not your living room. Control your kid or the flight staff should remove you." The sheer audacity of the man was breathtaking. Several passengers exchanged scandalized glances. A man across the aisle shook his head in disgust. The seeds of a collective outrage were being sown. Sarah, the flight attendant, stepped in again, her voice firmer this time. "Sir, that is entirely inappropriate. I need you to lower your voice. You are disturbing the other passengers." "I'm disturbing them." Rick laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "The screaming kid isn't the problem, but I am." "Is that the logic we're using now? This is political correctness gone mad." He wasn't just a man having a bad day. He was a man on a crusade, a self-appointed warrior against the minor inconveniences of the world that dared to impinge upon his personal comfort zone. And at that moment, his target was a small, heartbroken black child. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial yet venomous whisper that was perfectly audible to Hannah and Leo. "You people are always looking for a handout or an excuse. Teach the boy some discipline. The world doesn't owe him anything. You people." The words landed in the quiet space of the cabin with the force of a physical blow. It was no longer about a crying child. It was about something older, uglier, and infinitely more poisonous. The subtext was now text. That was it. The final straw. Leo, who had been trying so hard to be quiet, heard the menace in the man's voice. His fragile control shattered completely. A fresh wave of terrified sobs racked his body. He wasn't just crying from grief anymore. He was crying from fear. And that's when Rick Peterson snapped. He unbuckled his seatbelt with a vicious click, a clear violation of cabin rules as the plane was still ascending through turbulence. He leaned over his seat, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, his presence invading their personal space. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice booming through the cabin and silencing every other sound. "I said shut up. Do you hear me, boy? Shut your mouth right now, or I'll give you something to really cry about." The threat was naked, brutal, and directed at a child. A collective gasp swept through the nearby rows. Leo let out a terrified yelp and tried to shrink into Hannah's side as if he could disappear into her. The cabin, which moments before had been a space of individual journeys, was now a single, unified theater of shock and horror. Everyone was watching. Phones, which had been idly scrolling through social media, were now subtly being raised. In the hushed, tense silence that followed Rick's outburst, only Leo's frightened, hiccuping breaths could be heard. Rick Peterson sat back in his seat, a smug, triumphant look on his face. He had asserted his dominance. He had silenced the noise. He believed he had won. He had no idea that he had just detonated a bomb in the middle of his own life. Because he had failed to notice the look in Hannah Juliet's eyes. The fire that had been kindling was now a controlled white-hot inferno. The law professor, the civil rights advocate, the grieving widow, and the fiercely protective grandmother were all about to speak, and the cabin of Flight AA1827 was her courtroom. For a long moment, the only movement was the slow, deliberate way Hannah Juliet unbuckled her own seatbelt. She did not rush. Every action was measured, imbued with a gravity that seemed to pull the attention of everyone around her. She gently squeezed Leo's shoulder, whispering, "It's okay now, my love. Grandma's here. No one will ever hurt you." Then, with the quiet dignity of a queen ascending her throne, she stood up. She wasn't a tall woman, but in that moment, she seemed to tower over the cabin. She turned to face Rick Peterson, her back straight, her chin high. The ambient hum of the engines was the only sound in the suddenly rapt cabin. Rick looked up at her, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes, expecting another plea or a weak rebuke. What he got was something else entirely. Hannah did not shout. She did not raise her voice. She spoke in the same clear, modulated tones she had once used to dismantle flawed legal arguments in front of a lecture hall of 200 students. Her voice was a weapon, and she wielded it with surgical precision. "Sir," she began, and the word itself was a judgment. "My name is Hannah Juliet. This is my grandson Leo. We are on our way to Charlotte to bury my husband of 48 years, his grandfather who died on Friday." She paused, letting the information settle, letting the context of their journey permeate the air. You could feel the atmosphere shift. The irritation some passengers might have felt at the crying child instantly curdled into deep, profound shame. "This little boy," she continued, gesturing to Leo without taking her eyes off Rick, "is not crying because he didn't get a toy. He is crying because the man who taught him how to fly a kite, who read him stories every night, and who he loved more than anyone in the world, is gone forever. His heart is broken, a state I imagine you, with your gold watch and your profound lack of empathy, know absolutely nothing about." Rick's smug expression began to falter. A flush crept up his neck. "Now hold on a minute." Hannah held up a single elegant hand, and the gesture had all the force of a judge's gavel. He fell silent. "I will not hold on a minute," she said, her voice dropping a fraction, becoming even more intense. "You have had your minute. You used it to threaten a grieving 7-year-old child. You used it to flaunt your imagined superiority, and you used it to show everyone on this aircraft the barren, hollow space where your character ought to be." She took a step closer into the narrow space of the aisle. "You speak of control and discipline. Let me tell you about discipline. Discipline is a man who worked 2 jobs so his wife could get her law degree. Discipline is raising a son to be a good man and a loving father. Discipline," she said, her voice hardening, "is holding your tongue when your first instinct is to be cruel. It is a concept you are clearly and woefully unfamiliar with." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the nearby seats. A young man in row 24 had his phone up, openly recording. Rick saw it, and a flash of panic crossed his face. "And then?" Hannah pressed on her eyes like chips of flint. "You had the utter audacity to say, 'You people.' Let's be very clear about what you meant by that. You looked at a black child and his grandmother, and you saw not a family in mourning, but a problem to be managed, a nuisance. You saw a stereotype, not a human being. You reduced a little boy's profound sorrow to a racial cliché in a cheap suit." Rick sputtered, trying to regain his footing. That's not what I was talking about parents in general. You're twisting my words, am I? Hannah's voice was dangerously quiet. Did you lean over your seat and threaten to give my grandson something to really cry about? Or did I imagine that? Did you bellow at a child who was already terrified, or was that a figment of our collective imagination? She gestured around her. I suspect there are at least 30 witnesses on this plane who would testify that my hearing is perfectly fine. She looked past him, making eye contact with other passengers. She saw head nods. She saw looks of quiet, simmering rage on his behalf. She had the jury on her side. You are on your way to $1 million presentation, she said, her voice laced with contempt. A presentation where you will, I assume, attempt to convince other human beings to trust you, to trust your judgment, your character, your integrity. But you have just shown us who you are. You are a bully, a small, petty man who finds his strength in menacing children and insulting senior citizens. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more chilling than a shout. My husband, James Juliet, was a man of substance. He built community centers. He mentored young men who had no fathers of their own. He was a pillar of quiet strength and boundless kindness. His legacy will live on in the lives he touched. Your legacy based on this performance will be a viral video of you terrorizing a child on an airplane. I wonder which of you is the more successful man. With that, she stood to her full height. She had not insulted him with crude names. She had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection was grotesque. So you may have your first-class ticket and your expensive watch, sir. She concluded her final words, ringing with an undeniable finality. But you are the poorest man on this aircraft. Hannah Juliet turned her back on him, a gesture of complete and total dismissal. She sat down, pulled a tissue from her purse, and gently wiped the tears from Leo's face. She adjusted his seatbelt and then fastened her own. She had said all that needed to be said. The silence that followed was absolute. Rick Peterson sat frozen in his seat, his face a mottled patchwork of red and white. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting around the cabin. He saw nothing but disgust and contempt staring back at him. The flight attendant, Sarah, stood in the aisle looking at him as if he were a piece of garbage she needed to dispose of. The phone was still recording. He had been publicly, eloquently, and devastatingly dismantled. The verdict had been delivered, and he had been found guilty on all counts. The immediate aftermath of Hannah's speech was a study in silent solidarity. The tension didn't disappear. It transformed. The shared shock curdled into a collective unspoken pact to isolate Rick Peterson and support Hannah and Leo. It was as if a force field of decency had sprung up around row 22. Sarah, the flight attendant, was the first to act. Her professional demeanor was now layered with a profound personal respect for Hannah. She leaned down, speaking softly. Mrs. Juliet, on behalf of the entire crew, I am so deeply sorry for what you and your grandson just endured. That was completely unacceptable. She glared over the seat at Rick. Sir, I will be filing a full incident report. Do not speak to these passengers again. Rick, still reeling, just stared ahead, his jaw working silently. He had no response. The alpha male posturing had been stripped away, leaving behind a raw, twitching nerve of humiliation. Is there anything at all I can get for you? Sarah asked Hannah. We have a tablet with games and movies for the little one. And for you, a drink from first class. It's on the house. Anything you want. The water will be fine, dear. Thank you, Hannah said with a small, weary smile. She was emotionally drained but resolute. And perhaps a blanket for Leo. As Sarah hurried off, a woman from the row in front turned around. She was in her 40s with kind eyes and a doctor's bag at her feet. "Excuse me," she whispered. "I'm Dr. Amelia Hayes. I'm a pediatrician. If your grandson is feeling overwhelmed, I'd be happy to check on him. Sometimes a panic attack can feel very frightening for a child." "That is incredibly kind of you," Hannah said, touched by the offer. "He's just very sad. But thank you." One by one, small gestures of support flowed towards them. The man across the aisle passed over an unopened bag of pretzels. The young woman who had offered a smile earlier handed back a coloring book and a small pack of crayons from her bag. It was a silent communal apology for the ugliness they had all just witnessed. Each act was a stitch mending the tear Rick Peterson had ripped in the fabric of their shared humanity. Leo, nestled securely against his grandmother, had finally stopped crying. Her powerful defense of him, the quiet strength she projected, was a more effective balm than any distraction. He felt safe. He watched the small acts of kindness with wide, curious eyes, his grip on Captain Fuzzy loosening slightly. Meanwhile, Rick Peterson stewed in a toxic brew of fury and self-pity. His internal monologue was a raging torrent of justification. "How dare she, twisting my words, making me the bad guy? I'm the victim here." My concentration was shattered. That kid was out of control. And that old woman with her sanctimonious speech. Who does she think she is? He glanced at the young man, who was now unsubtly emailing the video from his phone. Great. Just great. This is going to be a PR headache. He was already framing it as a problem to be managed, not a moral failing to be confronted. His mind was racing, trying to get ahead of the story to spin the narrative. He was the victim of an overly sensitive, politically correct mob. That would be his angle. But he was so consumed by his own righteous indignation that he failed to notice a crucial detail. 4 rows ahead of him in the bulkhead seats of the premium economy cabin sat a man who had observed the entire exchange without a word. He was a quiet, impeccably dressed man of Asian descent in his late 50s, named Owen Patrick. He had a preternatural stillness about him, the kind that comes from a position of immense and understated power. He hadn't turned around. He hadn't gasped. He had simply listened, his head tilted slightly, absorbing every word. When Sarah, the flight attendant, passed his row on her way back to the galley, he flagged her down with a subtle, discreet gesture. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an easy authority. "I couldn't help but overhear that unfortunate incident." Sarah's face tightened. "Yes, sir. I'm so sorry it disturbed you. We are handling it." "You're handling it very well," Mr. Patrick said with an approving nod. "I was just wondering if you happened to catch the name of the gentleman in seat 26C. He gestured behind him with his thumb. "I have his name on the passenger manifest, sir, and I'll be including it in my report. It's Richard Peterson." She supplied her voice laced with professional disapproval. "Richard Peterson." Mr. Patrick repeated the name, rolling off his tongue with a certain clinical detachment. He looked down at the tablet in his lap, where he had an email open. The subject line read, "Introductory meeting at 2 p.m., Sterling Solutions and Apex Innovations." He tapped the screen, opening a list of attendees. The first name under Apex Innovations was Richard Peterson, VP of Strategic Accounts. A slow, cold understanding dawned in Mr. Patrick's eyes. He had been flying from his company's Chicago office to their headquarters in Charlotte. He was on this specific flight for the sole purpose of making it to a 2:00 meeting. A meeting with a potential new vendor, a hotshot vice president from a company called Apex Innovations, who was coming to pitch them a multi-million-dollar logistics overhaul. A man named Richard Peterson. Mr. Patrick looked back at Sarah. "And the lady Mrs. Juliet, you said?" "Hannah Juliet, sir. A true class act," Sarah said with genuine admiration. "Indeed." Mr. Patrick murmured a thoughtful, almost dangerous glint in his eye. "Thank you. You've been very helpful." He turned back to face the front, his mind working with the silent, swift efficiency of a supercomputer. He had learned more about Richard Peterson's character judgment and temperament in the last 10 minutes than he would have in a dozen 2-hour presentations. The $1 million pitch Rick was so worried about had in effect already happened, and it had been an unmitigated disaster. The unseen witness in row 18 was not just any passenger. He was the judge, jury, and as Rick Peterson was about to discover the executioner. The rest of the flight passed in a thick, uncomfortable silence. For Hannah and Leo, it was a quiet cocoon of gentle whispers and shared grief buffered by the kindness of strangers. For Rick Peterson, it was an eternity spent in a pillory of his own making. He tried to work on his presentation, but the words on the screen swam before his eyes. He could feel the weight of dozens of judgmental stares. Every cough, every rustle of a snack bag felt like a condemnation. He was no longer a master of the universe in a tailored suit. He was a pariah in a pressurized tube. When the plane finally began its descent into Charlotte, a palpable sense of relief spread through the cabin. The landing was smooth, and as the aircraft taxied to the gate, the familiar chime, signaling it was safe to use electronic devices, sounded. Instantly, the cabin was filled with the soft glow of phone screens. Rick saw the young man a few rows back, furiously typing. He knew what was happening. The video was being uploaded, tagged, shared. A knot of pure dread tightened in his stomach. As the seatbelt sign switched off, the usual rush to deplane began. Rick, eager to escape this flying tribunal, was one of the first to stand up, grabbing his expensive leather briefcase from the overhead bin. He deliberately avoided making eye contact with anyone, his face a stony mask. Hannah, however, was in no rush. She helped Leo gather his coloring book and made sure Captain Fuzzy was secure in his arms. They would wait until the aisle cleared. As the stream of passengers began to thin, a man from a few rows ahead stopped beside them. It was Owen Patrick. He looked at Hannah with an expression of profound respect. "Mrs. Juliet," he said, his voice warm and sincere. "My name is Owen Patrick. I was sitting up in row 18. I wanted to offer my deepest condolences for your loss and to tell you that I have never in my life witnessed such a display of grace and strength under pressure. Your husband must have been a remarkable man to have had such a remarkable partner." Hannah was taken aback by the formal yet deeply felt tribute. "Thank you, Mr. Patrick. That's very kind of you." "Not at all," he replied. He then crouched down slightly to Leo's level. "And you must be Leo. That's a very brave bear you have there." Leo, clutching Captain Fuzzy, gave a small, shy nod. "Your grandmother is a hero, you know that," Mr. Patrick said with a gentle smile. It was at that moment that Rick Peterson, who had been impatiently waiting in the aisle, decided he couldn't take another second of being ignored. He pushed past a lingering passenger, trying to get to the exit. This brought him face to face with the trio. He shot a venomous glare at Hannah before noticing the well-dressed man speaking to her. He saw an expensive understated suit and a look of authority. A potential business contact, perhaps. He quickly rearranged his face into a mask of corporate affability. "Excuse me," Rick said, trying to edge past. Mr. Patrick stood up slowly, turning his full attention to Rick. The friendly warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a gaze as cold and hard as polished granite. "Richard Peterson," Mr. Patrick said. It was not a question. Rick was momentarily thrown. "Yes, I'm sorry, have we met?" "Not formally, Mr. Patrick replied, his voice dangerously calm. "My name is Owen Patrick. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Solutions." The name of the company hit Rick like a physical blow. Sterling Solutions. The company he was flying here to pitch. The biggest potential client of his entire career. He felt the blood drain from his face. His carefully constructed professional mask cracked. Mr. Patrick," he stammered, his mind whirring in panic. "Sir, what a coincidence. I'm Rick Peterson from Apex Innovations. I'm here for our 2:00 meeting." "Yes," Mr. Patrick said with a slow, deliberate nod. "About that meeting." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was screamingly uncomfortable. Rick started to sweat. He could see Hannah and Leo watching, could feel the eyes of the remaining passengers and the flight attendants who were discreetly observing from the galley. "Mr. Peterson," Mr. Patrick continued, his voice as flat and final as a tombstone. "I'm afraid that meeting has been cancelled. In fact, any and all future business prospects between Sterling Solutions and Apex Innovations are hereby terminated effective immediately." Rick's jaw dropped. "What, sir, I don't understand. We haven't even had the meeting yet." "Oh, but we have," Mr. Patrick corrected him. "We have. For the past 2 hours, I've had a front-row seat to your character, Mr. Peterson. I've seen your decision-making process under pressure. I've witnessed your method of communication. I've learned how you treat people you perceive as being beneath you, and I have concluded that you, and by extension, the company you represent, lack the integrity, the decency, and the basic human compassion required to be a partner of Sterling Solutions." He gestured towards Hannah and Leo. "Our company is built on respect, on partnership, on the idea that how you do something is just as important as what you do. You have just demonstrated in the most public and repulsive way imaginable that you and your company are not a fit for us." Rick was speechless. His world, which had been teetering on a cliff edge, had just been shoved into the abyss. This wasn't just a lost deal. This was a career-ending catastrophe. The CEO of his target company had just personally witnessed his worst moment. "Sir, please," Rick pleaded, his voice now desperate. "It was a misunderstanding. The kid was crying. I was stressed." "Do not," Mr. Patrick interrupted, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. "Insult my intelligence by making excuses for your behavior. You threatened a child. You insulted a woman in mourning. You did it because you thought you could. You thought they were powerless. You were wrong." He turned his back on Rick, a final cutting dismissal, and looked back at Hannah. "Mrs. Juliet, I wish you and your family strength in the coming days. If there is anything my company or I can do for you, please do not hesitate to reach out." He handed her a business card. Then, without another glance at the utterly broken man standing in the aisle, Owen Patrick walked off the plane. Rick Peterson was left standing there, his briefcase feeling like it was filled with lead amidst the silent, damning judgment of everyone who remained. The karma hadn't just been swift, it had been corporate, clinical, and absolutely devastating. Rick Peterson stumbled off the jet bridge and into the bustling terminal of Charlotte Douglas International Airport, like a man in a trance. The ambient noise of announcements, rolling suitcases, and chatter seemed distant and muted. The only sound roaring in his ears was Owen Patrick's final damning pronouncement. Terminated effective immediately. He pulled out his phone, his hands trembling. He needed to call his boss, Mark Thompson, the president of Apex Innovations. He had to get ahead of this. He had to spin it, frame it, control it. But it was already too late. His phone buzzed violently in his hand with an incoming call. It was Mark. Rick's heart plummeted. "Mark, listen," he began as soon as he answered. "Don't you listen me, Rick." "Mark." Thompson's voice was a furious bark. "What the hell did you do?" "My phone has been blowing up for the last 10 minutes. I just got an email from Owen Patrick himself." The Owen Patrick. "He called your conduct morally reprehensible and said he'd be issuing a press release blacklisting Apex from any future contracts. A press release, Rick. Do you have any idea what that does to our stock?" "Mark, she was twisting my words," the kid was screaming. "I don't care if the kid was juggling fire, Rick," Mark roared. "Your job is to close deals, not get us blacklisted by the biggest fish we've ever tried to land. And it gets worse." "Worse?" Rick asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How can it be worse?" "Oh, it's worse," Mark said, his voice dripping with venom. "There's a video. It's on Twitter. It's everywhere. #plainbully. #airline Karen. That's you, Rick. The whole world is watching you threaten a little kid." Rick felt a wave of nausea. He numbly opened his Twitter app. He didn't have to search for it. It was the first thing on his feed retweeted by a major news aggregator. The video was clear, the audio crystal clear. It started with his ugly, red-faced shout, "I said, shut up." It then captured every single word of Hannah Juliet's calm, devastating takedown. There was no ambiguity, no room for spin. It was a digital document of his own self-destruction. In just under 3 minutes, his entire professional persona was incinerated. He could already see the comments, thousands of them a torrent of digital outrage. "This is Richard Peterson, VP at Apex Innovations in Chicago. Let's make him famous. The way that grandmother handled him, pure class. She's a hero. At Apex Innovations, is this who you have representing your company?" The corporate account was being flooded. His LinkedIn profile was being shared. His carefully curated image of a powerful, successful executive was being replaced in real time with a new one, a racist, child-abusing monster. "Mark, I can fix this," he said, the desperation raw in his voice. "I'll issue an apology. We can do damage control." "You can't fix this, Rick," Mark yelled. "You're a nuclear liability. The board is calling an emergency meeting. Clean out your desk. HR will be in touch about the terms of your separation. You're done here." The line went dead. Rick stood frozen in the middle of the terminal, people flowing around him like a river around a stone. Fired, blacklisted, humiliated. It was all happening so fast. His phone rang again. This time, it was his wife, Jessica. "Rick, I'm at my sister's house. She just sent me a video. Please tell me it's not you." Her voice was shaking. "Jess, listen. It's all out of context." "Out of context?" she cried, her voice rising with disbelief and horror. "Rick, I heard what you said. To a little boy. The way you looked. That rage. I've seen it before when the waiter is too slow or the dry cleaner loses a shirt. But I never. Not like this. And what you said. You people." There was a pause, filled with her shuddering breath. "My father is a black man, Rick. Our children are mixed race. Did you forget that? Of course not, I wasn't. It wasn't about race." He lied even to himself. "Don't lie to me, Rick. Not now," she said, her voice breaking. I can't have that in our house. Don't come home tonight. I need some time to think about everything." She hung up. In the span of less than an hour, Richard Peterson had lost the biggest deal of his career, his job, and now it seemed his family. He looked at his reflection in the dark screen of his phone. He saw the face of a stranger, a contorted mask of fury and hate that he no longer recognized but the world now knew as his own. The hard karma he had sown at 35,000 feet had followed him to the ground, and its harvest was brutal and absolute. He had demanded silence from a crying child, and in return the universe had silenced his career, his reputation, and his life as he knew it. He had wanted to teach a little boy a lesson, but in the end, he was the one who was about to learn the hardest lesson of all, that in the modern world there is nowhere to hide from the consequences of your own cruelty. 2 days later, under a Carolina sky so vast and piercingly blue, it felt like a benediction. Hannah Juliet stood on a gentle, manicured slope in Charlotte's Elmwood Cemetery. The air crisp with the first hint of autumn carried the sweet funereal scent of lilies and the earthy smell of freshly turned soil. Before her, surrounded by a somber gathering of family and friends, was the polished mahogany casket bearing the body of her husband, James. For 48 years, he had been her anchor, her partner in intellectual debate, her co-conspirator in laughter. Now the silence he left behind was a physical presence, a void against which all other sounds seemed to pale. Hannah held Leo's small, warm hand in hers. His fingers were curled tightly around her own, his other arm clutching Captain Fuzzy with a solemnity that befitted the occasion. He was dressed in a small dark suit his father had bought that morning, and he hadn't said a word since they'd arrived, his large, expressive eyes fixed on the casket. He didn't fully comprehend the finality of the moment, but he understood loss. He understood the profound absence that had settled over their family like a permanent shroud. The minister spoke of faith and resurrection, his words a soothing balm. Then Hannah's son, Marcus, Leo's father, stepped forward to deliver the eulogy. He spoke of James not just as a father, but as his hero, a man who taught him how to throw a baseball and how to be a man of integrity, with the same patient, unwavering attention. "My dad believed in building things," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion but steady. Not just with his hands, though he was a fine woodworker. He built community. He built confidence in young men who had none. He saw a broken world, and instead of cursing the darkness, he went out and built lamps. After Marcus, a young man named Daniel, now a successful architect, took the podium. James had been his mentor through the foundation. "Mr. Juliet saved my life," Daniel said simply, his voice cracking. "I was headed down a bad path. He didn't judge me. He just showed up. Every week. He taught me that my life had value, that my future was something I could build myself. Everything I have today, I owe to him." Hannah listened, and with each heartfelt tribute, a small piece of the crushing weight on her chest seemed to transform. The grief remained sharp and ever-present, but it was now interwoven with a powerful, radiant pride. This was James's legacy. It wasn't in stocks or property. It was etched into the lives of the people he had lifted. The incident on the plane felt like a fever dream, a distant, ugly memory from another world. The news cycle, as she'd been warned by Marcus, had exploded. The video was everywhere. Rick Peterson had been fired, publicly shamed. Apex Innovations had issued a groveling apology. But Hannah had refused to engage with it. She wouldn't allow that man's ugliness to tarnish the sanctity of this final goodbye to her husband. As the service concluded and the casket was lowered into the earth, a lone saxophonist began to play Amazing Grace. The mournful, soulful notes drifted over the assembled crowd, a perfect melody for a life of quiet grace. Leo, finally letting go of her hand, stepped forward with his father to place a single white rose on the casket's lid. In that small, solemn gesture, Hannah saw not just a grieving child, but the boy James had helped raise sensitive, loving, and fundamentally good. He was going to be all right. They were all going to be all right. Later at the reception held in the warm, sunlit hall of their local church, the atmosphere shifted from sorrow to celebration. Laughter mingled with tears as friends and family shared anecdotes. They remembered James's terrible puns, his unwavering support during tough times, his ability to make anyone from a senator to a janitor feel like the most important person in the room. Hannah found a quiet corner to sit for a moment, the emotional and physical exhaustion of the past few days settling deep into her bones. She idly picked up her phone, not intending to check anything specific, but simply for the mundane comfort of the habit. There were dozens of texts and missed calls from well-wishers. And then she saw an email, its subject line simple and direct. The sender's name cut through the noise of her grief, Owen Patrick. Her breath hitched. Part of her wanted to ignore it to keep the outside world at bay for just a little longer. But a stronger part, a sense of deep curiosity and a feeling that this story was not yet fully concluded, compelled her to open it. The email was longer and more personal than she would have expected. Dear Mrs. Juliet, I hope this email finds you at a moment of peace, though I know peace is a scarce commodity at times like these. I want to once again express my deepest sympathies for your loss. Since our flight, I took the liberty of learning more about your husband. The stories I have read online, from local news articles about his foundation to the guest book on the funeral home's website, paint a picture of a truly remarkable man. The world is poorer for his absence. The incident on the flight has, as I'm sure you're aware, become a major news story. I wanted you to know that I was contacted by several reporters, and I made it a point to highlight your incredible grace and courage. I emphasized that the story was not about a corporate takedown, but about a grandmother defending her grieving grandson with a strength and dignity that should serve as an example to us all. But that is not the primary reason for my email. In learning about the James Juliet Foundation for Young Men, I was profoundly moved. My own father was an immigrant who benefited from the mentorship of a kind man in his community, a debt our family has never forgotten. It is a cause that aligns perfectly with the philanthropic mission of Sterling Solutions, which is to invest in the architects of a better future. My board and I have had a discussion. We were so moved by your family's story, and so impressed by the legacy James left behind, that we would like to make a contribution. Enclosed is a confirmation of a wire transfer to the foundation in the amount of $250,000. We hope this donation will help his vital work continue and flourish, turning a moment of ugliness into a lasting legacy of hope. My father used to say that good character is the only investment that always pays dividends. Your husband was clearly a very wealthy man in that regard. It is an honor to invest in his returns. With deepest respect, Owen Patrick, CEO, Sterling Solutions. Hannah read the email 3 times, the words blurring through a sudden thick film of tears. She felt a sob catch in her throat, a sound of such overwhelming cathartic release that she had to press a hand to her mouth. It wasn't sorrow, it was awe. Rick Peterson, in his petty, selfish rage, had been obsessed with $1 million deal. His cruelty was an attempt to protect his own potential for profit, and yet that very act of cruelty had become the catalyst for this, an act of staggering generosity that would secure her husband's life's work for years to come. It was the most beautiful poetic justice she could have ever imagined. She looked across the room at Leo, who was now sitting with his cousins, carefully showing them the buttons on Captain Fuzzy's coat. A small, genuine smile finally graced his lips as he explained something to them. She walked over to him, her steps feeling lighter than they had in days. She knelt down her joints, protesting slightly, until she was at his level. "Leo, my sweet boy," she said, her voice thick but clear. "A very kind man, the man we met on the plane, just did something wonderful for Grandpa." Leo looked at her, his head tilted. "He did?" "Yes," she said, stroking his cheek. "He made sure that Grandpa's club for helping boys can keep going for a long, long time. He's going to help hundreds of other boys, all because of Grandpa. And because you were so brave." A flicker of understanding crossed his face. He had been at the center of a storm, and on the other side of it, something good had happened. Hannah stood up and looked around the room at the faces of all the people James had loved, at the community he had built. The grief was still there, a hollow ache that would likely never fully disappear. But it was no longer the only thing she felt. Now it was accompanied by a fierce, brilliant hope. Richard Peterson had tried to silence a child's grief, but in doing so had only made James Juliet's legacy of kindness reverberate louder than ever before. The world had thrown its worst at them, but love and character, the true wealth of a life well lived, had delivered the final resounding word. And that's where our story ends. A man who thought his comfort was more important than a child's pain learned a lesson that cost him everything. But this story is about so much more than just revenge. It's about the incredible strength of Hannah Juliet, a woman who showed us that the most powerful response to hate isn't more hate, but unshakable dignity. It's about how the decency of one man, Owen Patrick, could turn a hateful act into a $250,000 legacy of hope for an entire community. It reminds us that our actions, big and small, have ripples we can't even imagine. If this story moved you, and you believe that kindness and courage should always win, please help us spread this message. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories that matter. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Hannah's powerful words. Thank you for watching.